As all of you can see, I'm now back in London after a peaceful and invigorating mountain holiday in Switzerland, and I return and am making this video on the 4th of July. And can I take this opportunity first of all to extend to all people in the United States my very best wishes on this, the anniversary of their independence from Britain. And it is an important event. 4th of July was an extremely, it is an important event because of course it commemorates the American Revolution, a revolution which was the first revolution that was started with a declaration of independence that spoke about inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and which of course also in effect set the course for the establishment of a republic, and through that republic for the establishment of a constitutional democracy. Now, the United States has often fallen short of the ideals of its founders. It's often deviated from its constitutional principles. In no way disguises or alters or changes the seminal breakthrough that was achieved back in the 18th century when the Americans rose up against the monarchy of the British King, King George III. So my heartiest congratulations to you all, and I hope that all of you will enjoy the celebrations of this most important holiday. 4th of July this year is, I'm afraid, also an altogether more dismal anniversary. It is the anniversary, or rather not the anniversary, it is 1 month since the start of Ukraine's offensive, the one that was being talked about relentlessly since the winter, the one for which all those tanks and other machines were supplied in the West, the one concerning which all those confident predictions by many people were made of rapid victory by Ukraine, a breakthrough to the Sea of Azov, a severance of the Russian land bridge to Crimea, all of that. Well, a month has passed, a month of very heavy fighting. The best guesstimates that I've seen, and they're only estimates, but the best guesstimates suggest that Ukraine has lost around 20,000 men, dead and wounded, over the course of this battle, this offensive. There was, by the way, an extremely distressing, at least to me, protest in Kiev the other day, in which people protested about the fact that insufficient steps have been made in Ukraine to expand the size of Ukrainian cemeteries, because apparently there isn't enough room in them to properly house the bodies of the dead. Well, anyway, this offensive, with all its tragic consequences, all its tragic results, has been underway now for a month, and it is essentially where it started. There's been no quick gains. Ukraine hasn't reached in any place the major fortifications, the great fortified lines created by the Russians over the course of the autumn and winter and spring. The fighting continues to be in what the Russians and Ukrainians continue to call the grey zone. There's claims that Ukraine has captured 8 villages, or sometimes it's 10, or sometimes it's fewer than this. Many of these villages, small deserted places, change hands on a regular basis. And there's no sign up to this point of any great advance, any great breakthrough. The battle, the fighting continues in its same sporadic way. Now, the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has provided a summary of the situation. He attended a meeting of the Defense Ministry Board. It was a teleconference of the Defense Ministry Board. Many people, by the way, have pointed out that there's no photos of General Surovikin at this meeting. There hadn't been photos of General Surovikin for some time, not since the events on the 24th of June, when he appeared in a video carried by the Russian Defense Ministry website, in which he called on the Wagner forces to end their mutiny. And some people continue to make all kinds of extravagant claims about what this means, and there's still reports circulating that he's under arrest or under investigation or something of that sort. I would point out that the other person that we've been hearing so much about in terms of the military affairs, General Gerasimov, he also hasn't been visible either. He is the chief of the General Staff, who Prigozhin wanted to sack. And even though we have been told by the Russians, officially, that he remains very much chief of General Staff, he too has been largely invisible. And by the way, that is the pattern with Russian generals. They are rarely visible, they rarely give interviews or programs or appear on programs or on television or anything like that. As far as I can remember, Surovikin has only given one proper interview in all the time that this conflict has been underway, and that was an interview he gave on, I think it was Russia 1 television back in October, when he was appointed overall commander of the Russian forces in the theatre. He was only held that position for a relatively short time before he was replaced by the Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov. But as I've said many times, in my opinion, Surovikin remains in day-to-day management of combat operations. And in my opinion, in that short broadcast he made on the 24th of June, he actually effectively confirmed that. So I don't think there's any reason to think anything in particular about the fact that neither Gerasimov nor Surovikin have been very visible. Ukrainian commanders, Ukrainian generals, Zaluzhny, Syrsky and Budanov are much more media visible, which makes Zaluzhny's 6-week-long relative disappearance until he gave that interview with the Washington Post, which I discussed in one of my recent videos. That made that disappearance much more interesting, and in my opinion much more important and significant. And I've already made clear now my own view, which is now I think my decided view, that Zaluzhny was never at any point wounded or in shock or receiving medical treatment. I take back my own previous guess that he might have been suffering from some kind of depression. I go back, I revert to my original view, which is that he was opposed to the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian offensive, which we'll come back to in a moment, and that he essentially worked to rule and wasn't prepared to participate in any of the decisions connected to it. That interview he gave with the Washington Post, which I discussed in my program a couple of days ago, to my mind, essentially confirms Zaluzhny's strong opposition to the entire idea of an offensive conducted without sufficient artillery support and without air cover. Anyway, that brings me back now to General Shoigu, to Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, and he's now given an overview of the special military operation, and he's discussed what is happening on the battlefields. I should say that this is what we're going to get are only introductory comments. The meeting was not apparently or purportedly about the military operation as such. It was all about modernization of the A-50, the Beriev A-50 AWACS aircraft, which is Russia's major AWACS aircraft and which has been heavily used by the Russians over the course of this operation. But anyway, that was the purported purpose of the meeting. That discussion is not reported. It's, by the way, the sort of thing that Shoigu probably spends most of his time doing. As I've said many times, he's a manager and an administrator, not a commander, and all attempts to try to make an issue of the fact that he does not come with a military background show a misunderstanding of his role. But anyway, I'm not going to touch on the discussion about the modernization of the A-50 AWACS aircraft. I don't really think that this is a topic that is suitable for discussion on this sort of program. Though I will say that there have been some stories about the Russians using other advanced machines, war machines, over the course of this conflict, and that I will come to in a short time. But anyway, this is what Shoigu said about Ukraine's offensive. He said the following: the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to inflict effective fire damage on the enemy, significantly reducing the offensive potential of the armed forces of Ukraine. The groups of the Russian armed forces have neutralized 15 aircraft, 3 helicopters, and 920 pieces of armored hardware, including 16 Leopard tanks in the South Donetsk, Zaporozhye and Donetsk directions alone, where Ukrainian troops are making futile attacks. This is nearly all of the tanks of this type that Poland and Portugal provided to the armed forces of Ukraine. Of course, it wasn't just Poland and Portugal that provided Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Germany and some other countries, Finland and others did so as well. But anyway, what Shoigu appears to be saying is that 16 Leopard 2 tanks, and he clearly means Leopard 2 tanks, have been destroyed in total. And then he goes on to say Ukrainian troops have lost a total of about 2,500 pieces of various weapons in all directions since 4th June 2023. Over the past month, Russian air defense units have shot down 158 HIMARS rockets, 25 Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and 386 unmanned aerial vehicles. Now, this is an interesting twist about the unmanned aerial vehicles. I've discussed this before. Western commentators say that now, on average, Ukraine loses around 10,000 drones a month. 10,000 drones a month. And we see Shoigu, by contrast, saying that Ukraine has only lost, since the 4th of June, 386 unmanned aerial vehicles. He's clearly counting different vehicles. He clearly isn't including in this total the small commercial drones that Ukraine has adapted and is trying to use for reconnaissance purposes. And most of those drones apparently are made in China, and apparently the Chinese, or so one hears, have now imposed export restrictions on these drones, and there's apparently been complaints from Ukraine that they're no longer able to source these drones and that this is creating problems for them. And I even read in one of the many publications that the West writes, I can't remember which one, that a Ukrainian official has now admitted that Russia is now has a decisive and clear-cut advantage in drones. Well, we'll come to that in a moment. And then Shoigu goes on to say, overall, neither of the enemy's goals in either direction, he means the Donbass and Zaporozhye Kherson region, have been met. This confirms the prowess of Russian warriors and the obviously inflated hopes for the acclaimed Western armaments. And then he says that the Ukrainian leadership, under the pressure of its Western controllers, is insisting that the Ukrainian military command continue to attack despite significant losses. Shoigu then does go on to discuss another topic. He discusses the Prigozhin mutiny, and as is now become very typical amongst Russian officials, he refuses to name Prigozhin. He doesn't give his name. He says, I must take into consideration one more issue to which our Supreme Commander-in-Chief has already given a comprehensive answer. The Supreme Commander-in-Chief is, of course, President Putin. It is about an attempt to destabilize the situation in Russia on 23rd to 25th of June 2023. These plans failed mainly because the armed forces personnel were loyal to the military oath and their military duty. The provocation itself did not have any impact on actions of the groups of forces. I thank the Russian servicemen for their faithful service. So Shoigu says that the fundamental reason why the Prigozhin coup attempt failed was because not a single military officer, Russian military officer, or military unit sided with Prigozhin. And he also says that it was this across-the-board loyalty of the Russian armed forces to the president and to the legal chain of command which guaranteed the Prigozhin mutiny's collapse. And of course he is right. Again, I'm going to say a little bit more about Prigozhin and what he's up to at the moment a little later in this program. But anyway, this is Shoigu's account, and I don't think anybody realistically can argue with it. He says that the offensive is deadlocked, that he's not made any progress, that Ukraine continues to attack because it's basically under orders from the West to attack, but all of its attacks up to this point have been unsuccessful. And he seems to expect and appears to predict that the offensive will continue to be unsuccessful. There's no reason to think that things are going to change. At least that's Shoigu's assessment. And I'm going to say it's an assessment which more and more people in the West are starting to share. And I read yesterday a very interesting article by a British Army officer, Richard Kemp, in the Daily Telegraph. He's been one of the people who's been most bullish about Ukraine's prospects and about the prospects of Ukraine's offensive. And I noticed that the title of the article said, Russia's time has almost run out. It seemed very strange in the context of what is actually going on, and in fact what many other Western commentators are writing. And then, of course, we come to the subtitle, Ukraine's offensive disappoints. Then he goes on to say, the Kremlin's strategy of wearing down Kiev is no longer tenable. And then the article goes on to say, even if Ukraine's counteroffensive might be unfolding more slowly than many expected. It is Moscow, not Kiev, that is running out of time. Since the operation began weeks ago, little territory has changed hands. This is despite expectations stoked by Kiev's allies, who of course on this include Mr. Kemp himself, who have been eager to show bang for their buck to electorates keenly aware of the cost of the war. And then of course we have comments like this: even with billions of dollars of Western aid, Ukraine lacks the kind of overwhelming force that allowed the US-led coalition to rapidly crush Iraq in 1991 and 2003. It's interesting that Mr. Kemp has only now come to that conclusion. And then he says, amid a succession of probing attacks to find weaknesses in the Russian lines, hopes of a quick breakthrough, such as we witnessed in Kharkov and Kherson last year, are being displaced by fear that Kiev's NATO-equipped forces will be dashed to pieces and Russia will go back onto the offensive. And then he goes on to explain, in a really, I found, very strange article, that in fact, despite the fact that Ukraine's, and again I'm quoting from him, slow-going offensive, which has already sustained significant casualties in men and machines, might be seen to be playing into Putin's plan to wait it out. How much time, he then asks rhetorically, does Putin really have? And then, of course, there comes the analysis, the discussion about the Wagner mutiny and the supposed cracks in the Russian political system, and the supposed doubts about Russia's ability to crank out weapons, which I'm going to come to shortly. But anyway, as we can see, even Richard Kemp, despite his heroic attempts to try to spin things to look the opposite way of the way they do, admits that after a month of fighting, Ukraine has made insignificant, not limited, territorial gains, and it has suffered heavy losses in tanks and machines and in men in making those insignificant gains, and that the offensive overall has been a disappointment. But of course he continues to insist with us. He tells us that all we need to do is to keep going. We need to wait and press on. We need to give Ukraine even more weapons. We need to provide Ukraine with even more weapons than it already has. He says that at present Western support is only sufficient to deny Russia any further gains. It won't be enough to enable Ukraine to take back its occupied territory. For that, we will need to see a significant increase in military aid, as well as uncompromising efforts to deter and interdict weapons supplies to Moscow, especially from Iran. I have to say, I found this one of the most bizarre articles I have ever read over the course of this military operation. It acknowledges the failure of the first month of the offensive. It acknowledges the fact that Ukraine has made no progress, no real progress. It acknowledges the fact that Ukraine has suffered heavy losses. It acknowledges the fact, I haven't talked about this, but it's there in the article, that the Russians are conducting a successful attrition of Ukraine's forces. It acknowledges the fact that with the forces at its disposal, Ukraine cannot achieve a breakthrough and recover territory. But it still tries to claim that it is Russia, not Ukraine, that is on the back foot, and that it is the Russians who are facing some kind of crisis, that they're going to run out of weapons at some point, and that notwithstanding that, the obligation apparently is on the West to continue not just to support Ukraine, but to escalate support for Ukraine even more. But anyway, coming from this particular source, coming from someone who has been, as I said, consistently supportive, extremely supportive of Ukraine in this war, coming from someone who has regularly wanted to put the most positive spin on Ukrainian military performance, I take this to be a conclusive admission from even, as I said, that kind of Western observer, that this offensive is not succeeding. Can this change? Well, I'm going to come back to that topic of military production. I discussed in a few videos ago about how the Russians are now moving towards huge increases in tank production. And the CSIS also published another report, which I've also discussed in another program, about how Russia is never going to run out of missiles. Western expectations that it would. As I said, I remember reading the very first article about how Russia was going to run out of missiles in March 2022 in the Daily Telegraph, by the way. I remember reading another article in the Daily Telegraph which claimed that Russia was going to run out of missiles because Russian missiles use Ukrainian engines. By the way, these articles have never been retracted. There's never been any acknowledgement from the Telegraph or from any other British publication that those earlier articles were wrong. Anyway, we've had that admission from the CSIS that Russia is not going to run out of missiles. We've had the admission we've had these commentaries about big increases in tank production. The Pentagon itself is admitting that Russia is producing millions of shells every year, between 2.5 and 3.5 million shells. I understand the general consensus at the moment is that shell production in Russia is actually increasing. And I read yesterday another long piece which spoke about the major reorganization that is underway in Russian production factories, how Russia is now not only sorting out big volume production of tanks, but also of infantry fighting vehicles. The infantry fighting vehicle that the Russians appear to have decided to focus most of their energy on is the BMP-3M. Again, if you want to read about that book, that weapon system, I would suggest that you go to Kinnair's books, which discuss infantry fighting vehicles, Russian infantry fighting vehicles in detail. Anyway, that seems to be now being produced in large quantities, as are guns, missiles, rocket systems, every type of weapon system that you can talk about. Far from the Russians running out of weapons, as I've said many times, as I've discussed on numerous occasions, as Brian Beletic has discussed on numerous occasions, as Alex Vashinin has also discussed on several occasions. It is the West that is struggling to keep up with Ukraine's needs, and which is finding it increasingly difficult to do so. So, given that this is so, it doesn't look as if the Russians are going to run out of resources, military technological resources, to resist this Ukrainian counteroffensive if it is continued. And we are now getting dribbles of reports of other more advanced Russian weapons starting to appear on the battlefields. Now, even the West media, the Daily Telegraph again, had a long report the other day about the fact that Russian Lancet kamikaze drones have proved incredibly effective on Ukrainian battlefields, that the Russians are producing them in very large numbers, that they're modernizing and updating them, that other similar types of kamikaze drones are appearing also in increasing numbers. I'm going to suggest, by the way, that these Russian kamikaze drones, which have turned out to be so much more effective than the ones that the West has supplied to Ukraine, there may be lots of reasons and explanations for this. Russian electronic warfare advances, skills of drone operators, who's to say what the reasons are, but they have proved much more effective. Anyway, to my mind, these kamikaze drones that the Russians have been using on the battlefronts are now having a much bigger effect on the course of the battle than, say, the HIMARS rockets that Ukraine has been launching, which are, it seems, in increasingly short supply. And again, a couple of months ago, we had reports about a converted small bomb that was going to be placed on a rocket and launched by the HIMARS system. And we got reports that the United States was going to supply this system to Ukraine, and it was going to appear in significant numbers. Well, a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago, we heard about it being used for the first time, and we haven't heard much about it since then, which makes me wonder what exactly has happened to this particular project. Perhaps it has disappointed as well. But anyway, we have kamikaze drones starting to appear. We're having all these more advanced Russian tanks, the T-90Ms, the sophisticated gas turbine-powered T-80 tanks. They're also starting to appear in, as I said, very significant numbers. But we're also starting to hear some reports of more advanced Russian drones being used. Now, the Russians were very, very slow in developing drones. There was a long, complicated production and history behind drones. One gets the impression that the primary aircraft bureaus, Sukhoi, Mikoyan, were not really very interested in this kind of system. New bureaus, aircraft design bureaus, were created basically to develop these drones. Some of them were not particularly successful. Funding was confused. The Defense Ministry seems to have been uncertain about the effectiveness of these drones on a modern battlefield, which, by the way, is not surprising. Others outside Russia have also been uncertain about how effective drones really would be. These are bigger drones, like the Predator and the Reaper, would be on modern battlefields. But anyway, the Ukrainian war has now put this beyond doubt. A design bureau called the Kronstadt Bureau has successfully developed drones of this kind. Production has been initiated. They're starting to appear in increasing numbers on the battlefields, primarily used apparently for surveillance and reconnaissance, and apparently they are now starting to appear in significant numbers. They've been there in dribs and drabs, ever since the start of this military operation. But there are many, many more of them, apparently, than before, and they are making it possible for the Russians to carry out surveillance in Ukraine in ways that has not been the case until recently, or until relatively recently. And then there's been another story, and again, we have to be very careful here because this is very unconfirmed, but it might even be true, that the Russians carried out a missile strike on Ukraine. Some say that it was on the headquarters of the SBU, that's Ukraine's primary counterintelligence and law enforcement agency in a town called Sumy, that this attack was carried out by an S-70 Ochotnik jet-powered stealth drone. This is a very, very powerful drone indeed. I'm not sure I entirely believe this. This is a drone that has been in, until fairly recently, looked as if it was in a very early stage of development. I'm not convinced that the Russians would have used it on the battlefields. But if it is the case, and the Russians have tried out and tested some of their weapons, new weapons both in Syria and in Ukraine by their own admission, if this is the case, then this is the first time that a stealth bomber, jet-powered bomber, albeit an unmanned jet bomber, has been used in this war up to this point. Now, as I said, this report may not be true, and one should perhaps take it with a major piece of skepticism. The other thing that is now changing the contours of the battlefield, and the single factor which, in my opinion, makes it inconceivable that this offensive will achieve any particular breakthrough, or can achieve any particular breakthrough, is that, putting aside the question of machines, the fact that the Russians are stockpiling vast numbers of weapons, tanks, aircraft, other types of machines to conduct this war, the big difference is in trained manpower. Now, I discussed this in my short program yesterday, the fact that the Russians are busy recruiting thousands of men every day, 1,300 per day, according to Shoigu in a meeting he had with Putin some weeks ago. And Shoigu was careful to say that these troops are being trained to a very high level, to the same level as Russian regular troops. In fact, many of them are taking out contracts with the Russian military. Anyway, Shoigu says that these men are joining the military. It's clear that the Russians throughout the conflict have been extremely careful to conserve their forces as much as possible. And the result is that the Russian military is becoming increasingly well-trained, increasingly experienced in conducting battle operations, is becoming more effective every day on the battlefields, and is now developing a very, very large cadre of highly trained and highly experienced specialists with knowledge of conflict. And this force is being reinforced in that way all the time. By contrast, Ukraine, because of its strategy of both defending every millimetre of ground which the Russians attack, and also because of its strategy of launching these offensives in Kharkiv region, in Kherson region last year, and of course the offensive that is currently underway now, they are apparently running out of trained manpower. And this has been discussed for several months now, but it is becoming critical, and even Western media reporters are now starting to concede this. And you can supply an army with modern tanks, Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s, Abrams tanks. You can supply them with more infantry fighting vehicles. But if the troops who operate these machines are not fully trained to use them, if they've only had a few weeks of training, then they won't be able to use these machines effectively. And if they're not led by experienced and well-trained non-commissioned officers, junior officers, then of course they will suffer increasing problems on the battlefield, and their losses will mount, and the battle is extremely unlikely to be won. And that brings me to, in fact, the events of the last 24 or so hours, because again, we've been getting more and more reports of Ukrainian attacks now across the front lines. And even the Russians are now starting to say that these attacks, there's another attack in the Zaporozhye front lines, for example, in near Orechov, near Piatichatki, in all of these places. None of them achieved any kind of breakthrough. No advances were achieved anywhere of any significance. Ukraine accepted very heavy losses. The Russians are now starting to say that these attacks are starting to lose some of their force. They're no longer as powerful, and they're no longer as pushed with as much conviction as had been the case before. Now, lots of Russian commentators still say that there's tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops still in reserve, hundreds of thousands, some people say, and that some of these troops still possess significant numbers of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and such things, and that the major Ukrainian attack has still not appeared, and maybe we should wait to see what the Ukrainians achieve with that attack, if and when it ever comes. But nothing can change the fact that Ukraine's combat losses have been incredibly high after a month of an offensive that is going nowhere, that even people like Colonel Kemp, as I believe he properly is, are now admitting that Ukraine doesn't have the military force to push the Russians back in the way that he apparently hoped that it would be pushed back. And also, of course, it needs to be repeated that if the Ukrainians still do possess large numbers of troops in reserve and large amounts of equipment in reserve, so do the Russians. As I said, the fortified lines have never been reached, and according to Shoigu, their reserve forces are growing all the time. And in that meeting with Putin that he took place, as I said, about 2 weeks ago, Shoigu said that by the end of June, 2 tank armies and an army corps would have completed training. And there's been some speculation about whether these forces are intended to be committed to the battlefronts or for some other purpose. Well, who's to say? But anyway, the Russians obviously have more units, military units coming on stream. And of course, Shoigu said that by the end of June, these forces would be fully trained up and ready for combat. And we're now in July. So the Russians have increasing reserves even if Ukraine has increasing reserves as well. And though Ukraine may have some cards that it can still play, so of course there's Russia. Now, given this reality, which is now, as I said, becoming acknowledged even by Western commentators, that Ukraine is not achieving breakthroughs on the battle lines, I've discussed in several programs now growing concerns about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. We got reports earlier today that Ukraine has now cut off again power to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It continues to talk about risks connected to the nuclear power plant, the possibility of some event relating to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant can never be discounted, and with the NATO summit just days away, the risk of something like that happening remains very real. But it could be that that is Ukraine's big card before the NATO summit meeting in Vilnius, but we will see. Anyway, in the meantime, we've had confirmation that NATO has again extended Jens Stoltenberg's position as Secretary General for a further year. As I said, to my knowledge, this is unprecedented in NATO history. It already speaks of divisions within NATO. NATO cannot agree on a new Secretary General to replace Stoltenberg. And a former NATO Secretary General, Mr. Fogh Rasmussen, who's formerly Prime Minister of Denmark, he's now come forward again, and he said that even if Ukraine doesn't get NATO membership, some NATO states would be prepared to give Ukraine some kind of guarantee of assistance in the event that Ukraine were to find itself in a conflict with Russia again. Now, this is an interesting comment from Fogh Rasmussen because it actually waters down something that he said some weeks ago, which attracted a great deal of attention. Some weeks ago, Fogh Rasmussen was talking about countries like Poland and the Baltic states sending troops into Ukraine in the event that Ukraine was not granted NATO membership, or at least a timeline towards NATO membership. Well, as I've said many times now, a consensus apparently has been reached that at the NATO summit meeting, there will be no timeline offered to Ukraine for future NATO membership. And the latest word is that Ukraine's participation in the Vilnius summit meeting will be on a very limited basis. Ukrainian officials, probably Zelensky and his foreign minister, Mr. Kuleba, will probably be there in Vilnius, but they will only be able to participate in side meetings. They will not be able to participate in the main meetings that will be taking place on the part of the NATO powers in Vilnius. And notwithstanding this, notwithstanding that Ukraine is not going to be granted NATO membership or a timeline, Rasmussen no longer says that in that situation, Poland and the Baltic states will commit troops to Ukraine. Apparently, all that they will do is provide Ukraine with some kind of statement of promises of future assistance to enable Ukraine to defend itself in the event of a resumption of the war. And it's difficult to see how that differs in any substantive way from what we are seeing now. So this doesn't look so much like security guarantees. It looks like something significantly less than that. And all of this is happening alongside that mysterious meeting in Copenhagen, where it now does increasingly look as if some of the European countries met with representatives of the BRICS states to try to explore some mechanism to start negotiations with the Russians about ending this conflict. It seems that Nuland and Blinken were not key to these discussions, which took place in Copenhagen, which is interesting. Apparently this was principally a European project, though, as I said, there's very, very little information about the Copenhagen meeting. But alongside that, there have been some quiet steps taken by some European states to resume some kind of economic connections with Russia. The Czech Republic being one of these states, Latvia apparently being another. This has been on a marginal steps, but apparently something has been done, is being done, and apparently Austria is going along with that too. And of course, last but not least, President Erdogan of Turkey, who will also be at the summit in Vilnius, has again effectively ruled out membership of NATO for Sweden. And I'm starting to think that perhaps this time he means it. We'll just have to wait and see. So, an offensive that has gone wrong, a summit, a NATO summit in Vilnius, where all the NATO leaders are clearly uncertain what to do. They're now, it seems, perhaps starting to explore ways to get themselves out of the trap that they've led themselves into. Meanwhile, the other side is also having meetings, and it's gone completely unreported in the West, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has had a virtual summit meeting. It's chaired by Prime Minister Modi of India. Both Putin and Xi Jinping participated. It's been agreed that Iran will be joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's now going to become a full member as of today. And word is that Belarus is going to follow fairly soon. So this meeting has taken place. The comments that the leaders, Modi, Xi Jinping and Putin, have made have been of a fairly bland nature, though there does seem to be a concerted move to bring Afghanistan, with its now Taliban-led government, in from the cold. Modi gave particular stress to this. I can't help but think that before very long, Afghanistan, with its Taliban-led government, will be joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and perhaps other institutions of that nature, and that the Taliban, at least, have now reached agreements with the Russians and the Chinese, and it seems, interestingly, with the Indians as well, that they will come in effect from the cold. But of course, even as these discussions by the leaders take place, and this is, as I said, the fact that Iran is now joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is an important event. But the major discussions, the major talking points are not happening in this kind of virtual summit context. it seems that there are all sorts of officials, they're sometimes called Sherpas, by the way, meeting on the sidelines of these events from all of the big countries that form both the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS. And notice that these two organizations are beginning to establish multiple overlaps. There are 4 Eurasian institutions. There's the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Russian-led Military Collective Security Treaty Organization, and then there is the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. As I said, these are 4 institutions, but they all overlap with each other. They all participate in different formats, even when, for example, there are meetings of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is up to now restricted to Soviet-led states. Leaders like Modi and Xi Jinping participate increasingly now, even if only in a virtual manner. But anyway, as these institutions crystallize and work together, it seems that the major priority now for the eventual BRICS summit meeting, which is due to take place still in South Africa in September, is an agreement to set up a gold-backed reserve currency operated by the BRICS. And with more and more countries now lining up to join the BRICS, Ethiopia and Bangladesh being both countries that have announced that they have candidacy, they want to join the BRICS, more and more countries now joining the BRICS. I can't help but think that this is the big game in town now, with everybody apparently trying to find some means, some mechanism to develop an alternative international trading system outside that of the West. And it may not be a coincidence that even as all of these talks and discussions take place, the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has now announced that she is actually travelling to Beijing. The Chinese are known to have been absolutely infuriated by the fallout from Secretary of State Blinken's visit to China. They were very angry over over President Biden's comments about Xi Jinping being a dictator, but apparently Janet Yellen has communicated with the Chinese. She's trying to find some means, supposedly, to take some of the tension out of the economic conflicts between China and the United States. The Chinese have retaliated to some of the steps that the United States is taking to try to restrict export of high-end chips to China, silicon chips to China, by restricting exports of particular minerals and rare earths that are needed for chips. The Chinese are retaliated by taking those sort of steps. Yellen, who seems to be increasingly concerned by all of these moves, the move to set up a gold-backed reserve currency and these moves by the Chinese to retaliate to these American trade restrictions. Yellen seems to be trying to go to China to see if this whole process can now be slowed down. Though I have to say this, the Chinese themselves, the Chinese commentary about Yellen's visit is downbeat, to say the least. Global Times talks about the expectations being low. So we'll see what Yellen says when she's in Beijing, what she's able to do, whether things turn out any easier for Yellen than they were for Blinken, and where all that is leading to. But to reiterate again, this project to set up this gold-based BRICS reserve currency, very much still, I suspect, a work in progress. It's going to take a while for it all the pieces to come together. We should not be expecting it to emerge fully formed until some years have passed, or to establish itself fully until some years have passed. But anyway, this is the single biggest event, economic event, global event that is taking place today. And it is the one which is alarming and unsettling the United States, and which I am sure is the ultimate reason for Janet Yellen's trip to Beijing. And what we are increasingly seeing is that more and more of international trade is taking place outside the dollar. So Putin, in his introductory comments at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which, as I said, is taking place today, said that 80% of Russian-Chinese trade is now conducted in rubles and Chinese currency, RMB. But perhaps even more concerning for Yellen and for the US is that Argentina has now made a loan repayment to the International Monetary Fund, not in dollars, but in Chinese currency, in RMB, and that has been accepted by the International Monetary Fund. Chinese are very wary of internationalizing Chinese currency, the RMB, because of the nature of the Chinese economic system and of the very tight control of the RMB. But the fact that there is already trading being done in RMB on the margins to the extent that we see shows the demand for an alternative currency system to the dollar, and that demand appears to be growing, and that is what is making this supposedly gold-backed BRIC currency a particular concern. Now, what will come of all of this, it's impossible to say, but I'm also going to suggest that with this process accelerating, with it moving forward in the way that it is, I can imagine that this is one of the factors which is now putting more pressure on Western leaders to try to find some way out of this conflict in Ukraine, because it cannot have escaped the more intelligent amongst them that the major catalyst for these moves to develop alternative currency and payment systems and trading systems outside the Western ones is the economic war the West foolishly waged against Russia following the start of the conflict in Ukraine in February of last year. And if these processes that are now underway to set up reserve currencies, to set up independent trading systems, are to be slowed down, then some means to end this conflict becomes politically and economically expedient. Anyway, we shall see what happens, because of course the hardliners, as I've said many times, have not gone away. We see how Colonel Kemp says that the right thing to do in this situation is not to give up on Ukraine, even if it can't regain territory. It is to escalate even further, to provide Ukraine with even more weapons so that it can achieve, well, I'm not entirely sure what Colonel Kemp thinks it can achieve, but anyway, that's what he says. And of course, he also talks about the cracks, the divisions, the breakdowns in the Russian political system. This has always been the biggest hope, and it remains the hope still. And of course, it now centers on Wagner and on the Prigozhin affair. And we're getting lots and lots of stories and reports about Prigozhin. There's been a long article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, about the complexity of Prigozhin's business affairs. I've no doubt that they are extremely complex. The information about this very complex web of companies that he has controlled, of which I'm sure, by the way, the Kremlin is well informed. This information that has now appeared in the US media, it can only mean that the US Treasury, which is of course sanctioned Prigozhin, has been trying to investigate him for some time, trying to work out how he operates his business, and that they've been concerned about this. Anyway, they've provided, as I said, an extremely interesting breakdown of his businesses. One mechanism, by the way, through which they might have applied pressure on him, if that was the intention. But perhaps the most interesting thing that's come out is a piece from the Financial Times, which all but says that despite the fact that Prigozhin himself is apparently in Belarus, and there are reports that his jet has been flying backwards and forwards between Belarus and Russia, but doesn't necessarily mean that he himself is on that plane. But anyway, it seems that despite claims to the contrary, there's been no mass movement of Wagner fighters from the conflict area to Belarus, and that the Wagner fighters themselves are still saying that they want to continue to participate in the military struggle in Ukraine. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry seems implacable in insisting that they must, in that case, sign some kind of contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry. We don't know exactly how that is playing out, but certainly for the moment, there is no mass movement of Wagner fighters from Russia, or to be more precise, from the Donbass region to Ukraine. They are still there, and I'm starting to think that perhaps at some point in August, when whatever plans the Russians might have might be starting to crystallize, plans for offensives and all the rest, we could see the Wagner organization, or at least whatever the Wagner organization is called by then, participating in the fighting again. Anyway, no sign that I can see of any cracks in the Russian political and military system. We saw Shoigu's comments. The military remained full square behind Putin and the leadership of the Russian Defense Ministry. Coups in Russia, by the way, military coups in Russia, have had a singularly bad history. You have to go all the way back, I think, to the overthrow of Tsar Paul, way back in, I think it was 1801, for a military coup to have been successful. Unless, of course, you count the exceptional events of October 1917 as a coup. But if so, should be pointed out that was not carried out so much by the military, and it did in fact have the support of the All Russia Congress of Soviets, but I'm not going to get into a debate about that. But I think the prospects of a military coup, of a political breakdown in Russia now, are non-existent, and I suspect that Western leaders are gradually coming round to that view as well. So we'll see what they do. I said yesterday in my program that with the situation for Ukraine turning tragic, with the Russians becoming stronger, the only proper topic for discussion at Vilnius is how to find some way to begin negotiations with the Russians. And that, of course, continues to be my view. And I think all this talk about extra arms supplies, F-16s, TACMS missiles, all this talk about unilateral security guarantees that look like they're being watered down, all of that should be put aside, and Western leaders, it's beyond time that they finally faced reality. Well, that's my programme for today. I first, as I said, following my holiday back in London. I'm going to, by the way, I'm planning to do a programme about the start of the war, and or at least the current phase of the conflict. I'm thinking again, I've been looking at some recent articles about options that Putin supposedly had instead of the war. I'm going to discuss those, I think, fairly soon. So if you want, look out for that. And in the meantime, what I'd like to say again is have a very good day, and to remind you all that you can find all of our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram, that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, which you'll find the links to under this video. You can also go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there, our new magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today, and have a very good day.